Great. So yes, hello and good evening, everyone. So welcome to the Farm Woodland Forum. This is part of a series of webinars that we've been organising to take people through a kind of step-by-step process about how to plan and deliver your own agroforestry projects. So tonight's session is particularly about funding, which is obviously crucial to delivering your agroforestry. And we try to cover the length and breadth of the sort of UK and Ireland this evening. I'm just going to take myself off screen share for a moment so I can see everybody that's on the call, and mostly so I can see my Word document, which tells me who we have speaking this evening. We have apologies from Jeff Newman, who's going to speak from Natural England for England, and very kindly in his place, our first speaker will be Jim O'Neill. So from the Forestry Commission, Jim is the Agroforestry Development Manager. Then we've got Dr. Jim McAdam from the Irish Agroforestry Forum, and Eugene Curran for the Forest Service Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. And then we've got Geraint Jones, who's the Forestry and Farm Woodland Specialist at Farming Connect, and be speaking for Wales. We might have Mick Strachan. We're not completely sure. He might have forgotten and gone on holiday, but we'll hopefully he'll join us. And then rounding up the evening, we've got Ilona Coulson Ashworth from the Carbon Projects Manager from the Woodland Trust. He'll be talking to us about the development of hopefully of the work they've been doing on the Agroforestry Carbon Code, but also on the carbon markets, maybe a little more generally. So I'm going to hand over to Jim O'Neill to get things started. And what I would like to hear from each speaker before they get started is just a little bit of information about them, is what their favourite tree is and why, and then it's tight 10 minutes from everybody so we can get through a content pack session. So Jim, over to you.
Evening everyone. Favourite tree and why? It's sycamore. I've been a woodland officer in East Cumbria for nearly 30 years on and off, doing other jobs here and there in amongst, and invariably the most valuable tree and impressive tree I ever came across in nearly every woodland was always a sycamore, and that was if it had been abused or not. And it just shows the potential of sycamore if you look after it. They're pretty hardy, they grow in most places, and you know, value is a good thing, and if you can get them to grow and create some monetary value as well as getting the shade and shelter benefits, then all well and good. So yeah, there you go. Controversial, non-native, we'll see. Okay, well, I'll share my screen. Hopefully it'll all work. Let me know, Harriet.
Can see it. Yeah, can see it, Jim. Can't see it in full screen mode yet.
How about now?
It's thinking about it. Not yet.
It's all up on my end of the thing.
It seems a little frozen, so maybe it's just taking a moment. Do you want to start talking to it and I'll confirm if it appears?
So I'm starting off this evening's show, and really England is in between grants, shall we say, at the moment. So I can give you an outline of the direction of travel that we're heading towards, and give you some thoughts of how we'd like things to be. How it ends up remains to be seen, but it's certainly on our wish list. So any joy yet, Harriet?
No, it still seems to be thinking about it and a little bit frozen.
Is there anything I can do to reboot it? Shall I knock it off and go back in again?
You could try.
I'll stop share, and I'll share again. Any joy?
No, same issue. We may just have to accept it in the mode in which we can see it.
Okay, can you see anything at the moment?
Yes, so we can see it, we just can't see it as full screen.
Right, okay. Okay, so environmental land management in England is going to be the new grant scheme, and we're trying to design the agroforestry within ELM to be as flexible as possible for the end user, allowing the end user to design the agroforestry to suit them and their own particular circumstances. If you can imagine, you know, the north of England right down to the south coast, the geographical and climatic conditions are vastly different, and we need to have an adaptable scheme that allows different growing circumstances. You could plant the same thing in the north and the south and come up with very different results. So it has to be flexible enough to allow for that sort of thing. So a very important point, it is a work in progress, and a lot of what we're working on is still in confidence, and DEFRA, are not willing to share things just at the moment. So I will be skating over some of the issues quite lightly.
Jim, it's lost the loading symbol, so I don't know if it's worth trying to full screen it again, like going to slideshow and kind of go from beginning and give it another shot again.
Okay, I will try and close that one. No, nothing.
No, we can still just see it in the mode it's in. Never mind.
Okay.
We'll
Okay. So
persevere.
general ethos. I wonder if I can. I'll switch that screen off. I'll minimize your screen, so you can see the smaller screen there.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So general ethos of work is that we are considering that agroforestry is a management system in its own right. It's not part of something else. It's a whole system. We're talking about agroforestry as introducing more trees, woodland, and forestry into the farm's landscape. And there's the crucial bit is to benefit the farming system. So retaining an agricultural land use, which is really crucial for many things like tax and grant systems and land values, etc. So if it's managed effectively, it might allow farms to become more efficient and increase outputs. At the same time, delivering the environmental and management benefits such as carbon sequestration, soil and water conservation, and a host of other things that we all know and love. So produce from the tree element can provide new additional products from fruit, nuts, timber, whatever. And the objective might not always be to include produce from the trees. We might just be planting agroforestry for shade and shelter. But I believe that we should always at least consider what the tree element can bring to productivity at the planning stage. You never know; it might just yield something more. So, all right, okay. So agroforestry on the farm in England, effective planning and management of the agroforestry system is absolutely key. And if we don't look after that, the venture may at the very best break even. But it is important to understand that management will be more complex from the outset. You need to have available workforce and a sort of sales outlet for whatever product you're growing. It needs to be harvestable. And this is the real opportunity to consider how agroforestry might assist farms to combat climate change and rising prices. A real opportunity at the moment, which has really been brought home to us with recent events on how to increase productivity and perhaps reduce costs. Agroforestry can be represented by a range of different types, from hedges with trees right through to farm woodlands and everything in between. And one point to remember is that forestry environmental impact assessment regulations may well be relevant to agroforestry whenever projects reach greater densities. So following slides, we'll capture a little bit of agroforestry. So hedgerow trees might be the ideal starting point for farmers to think about agroforestry, greater number of trees into the landscape, but not taking up acreage, providing shade and shelter. Hedges can be traditional features with greater numbers of trees in it, or look at building sort of wider windbreak style hedges. And at the current time, you can get some sort of funding for hedgerow trees within the countryside stewardship. Going on to grazing systems, from low density to high density woodlands, greater density canopies on a grid-based design, if you like. Careful management of the tree canopy in relation to the grasswood is really important. You know, you're managing the sward and you're managing the canopy and the relationship between the two, and manage that in balance with timber quality as well, if that's an objective. So it is a bit of a juggling act. Wood pasture and traditional orchards can provide greater biodiversity opportunity. And currently, countryside stewardship has wood pasture and parkland option available. And next slide. So more regular alley designs that we probably all think of with some types of agroforestry. They're really good for arable systems, but can equally be good for grazing and grass management. So alleys might not just always be the sort of home for arable systems. It could just be it's an easier way to manage your grass systems. Tree elements can range from low-growing fruit and nut species through to timber species as well. And of course, I mentioned earlier on about the geographic, climatic and economic requirements. You know, it gives you opportunities to pick and choose your system to suit. And there is some orchard creation and management available in countryside stewardship at the moment. And on to lower densities of infield trees, shade and shelter for livestock and crops if planned effectively, and they can be randomly arranged or more linear systems. And again, there's infield tree planting part of the countryside stewardship at the moment. Riparian corridors and water buffers. Ideally, they would be fenced, so you're growing good sort of rough ground vegetation to develop, slowing and filtering water. But there's still a benefit in shade and shelter of the watercourse with trees that are open to grazing. And at the moment, we've got 10-metre wide riparian corridors available under the UCO offer, England Woodland Creation offer, from 10 metres upwards, that should say. So that there's an option, a live option at the moment. And on to shelter belts, shelter belt networks and copses and field corners. And again, these are available from 10 metres upwards in the UCO offer. But it's really important to remember that design of shelter belts doesn't necessarily equal quality timber. So the wider the shelter belt, the better the timber, but the less effective the shelter. So there's a balancing act in there to be made. So higher density, more ambitious woodland densities, if you like. There are restrictions in place with regard to UCO and agricultural use, but under ELM, the environmental land management, we're looking at those rules to be amended. So where agroforestry is an objective, we can overrule or override the current rules to make sure we're allowing agricultural activity. I think that's a real opportunity for more forestry-based agroforestry systems where some really good grazing land can be grown in conjunction with some excellent quality timber. So what might agroforestry grants look like? It's got to evaluate, you've got to evaluate where the agroforestry venture sits within the current farm holding. So an agroforestry creation plan might be an ideal first step. We're looking at capital costs and management payments in two broad tiers in the ELM. And where tree densities are over the forestry EIA threshold, there might be a requirement to carry out an EIA. But at the moment, the Forestry Commission have settled on 44 trees on a square grid basis, 51 trees on a triangular grid, not requiring EIA. So anything under those numbers, you don't need an EIA. And where you've got alleys of trees, as long as they're no closer than 24 metres apart, the tree spacing in the rows is free. So lots of work to complete, but the direction of travel is very encouraging. And the DEFRA team are working on agroforestry and they're committed to delivering it in 2024 and early 24, as I understand it. So very, very brief run through, and I really hope we can learn something from our colleagues from the other countries in the next talks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you so much for stepping in this evening at such short notice. So that was a quick whiz through England. And in the interest of kind of getting through all of our speakers, do put questions in the chat if you have them as we go, but we'll save the Q&A for the end. So now, Jim McAdam, if I can hand over to you, please. And if you can remember to start off with your favourite tree and why, and then lead into your presentation, that would be great.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you. And I didn't know what Jim was going to say, but my favorite tree is sycamore as well. For different reasons, because in my area, I live in a hill, an upland area in Northern Ireland, where there were past generations of people lived on these hills, and almost all their cottages are now tumbled down, ruined and abandoned. And round almost all those cottages, there are mature sycamore. So I feel as we walk over those hills that the spirit of our ancestors before us are actually in those trees, because they're around those cottages. Apart from that, it's also a great tree that grows in almost every situation. So anyway, okay, so it's another one for sycamore. I'll start talking then about agroforestry on Ireland, and
if you go to slideshow and then start from the beginning, or just from the beginning button. Sorry, I've confused things.
Yeah. Okay, everyone see?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to share my presentations with my colleague Eugene, Eugene Curran in DAFM in the Republic of Ireland, and I'm representing the Irish Agroforestry Forum on this, which I'll just say a word about at the end. As all of you know, of course, there are 2 jurisdictions on the island of Ireland. We come under the UK in Northern Ireland, and are outside of the EU, if you like, whereas Ireland still is a part of the EU and is a completely separate jurisdiction for all agriculture and forestry support. So it'll be interesting, just as when we get at the end, to see how agroforestry is supported very differently on both parts of this island, and perhaps we can learn from both how to go ahead. The actual form of agroforestry that is supported is based on the Loch Gall trials in Northern Ireland. I'm sure Eugene will say that too, which is now the longest, 30 years old, is the longest running replicated silvopastoral trial in Europe. And when Eugene and his colleagues came up 10, 12 years ago or so, they were quite impressed with how the trees performed in that 400 trees per hectare system, 5 by 5 meter planting. And that's the basis of our agroforestry support measure in Northern Ireland. And Eugene and colleagues also used it as the basis for the model they used to support in the south of Ireland. So both originate, because that is really, at that time, that was the only trial there was on agroforestry on which we could have an evidence-based policy, if you like. So what sort of measures have we got? And I've really widened it a bit, because I don't like just confining sort of a rigid definition of agroforestry. I'm really just going to look for sort of non-forestry options for tree planting and farmland in Northern Ireland, because these can be used to merge with agroforestry or mix with agroforestry. And all of these are agriculture measures. In other words, none of them come under the forestry measure. So all land that's classified for agroforestry is classified as farmland, if you like. So this is within an agri-environment scheme. And under the department's agri-environment measures, the environment, which is called the Environmental Farming Scheme in Northern Ireland, the EFS, so-called the wider options, there are several options available for planting trees on farms. One of those is, the main one, obviously, I'm going to go into detail on, is the establishment of agroforestry. But then there are 3 other options within that, and I'll talk briefly about them as well. They're for the creation of riparian buffers, and there are 2 or a 10 meter width. There are funding options for those planted with native trees. Now, those aren't grazed, but they can be along the boundaries of silvopasture or agroforestry. So they can, if you like, enhance an agroforestry application if you have a riparian leaf or a stream or a river, whatever, nearby. Then the funding for creating traditional orchards, which can be grazed. In fact, they're encouraged to be grazed, which in effect create a silvopastoral system and can have up to, well, the agroforestry system can have up to 50% fruit trees in it as well. So there are quite good options for getting orchards and fruit trees grown. And then hedgerows can be planted alongside silvopasture. And I think, you know, the gradation from hedgerow into silvopasture is an interesting model in a way to get trees onto farms. These all come under priority 4, the Rural Development Programme, which is about restoring, preserving and enhancing ecosystems related to agriculture and forestry. So when we think of the agroforestry measure, especially it's called the establishment of agroforestry, and this is the documentation taken from the department's own website, and this started in 1986, I think it was, and it was in consultation with myself about what would go into the scheme and so on then. And the option aims were to increase the area of agroforestry, which will provide carbon sequestration benefits. That's what they highlight. The option will also contribute to biodiversity, nutrient cycling, and water quality. Agroforestry, it says, will integrate trees with crops and or livestock on the same plot of land. And the establishment payment, which is made, it's a 5-year scheme. The establishment payment, which is made in year 1, is £1,637 per hectare. And in years 2 to 5, there's a small management grant, if you like, to allow for tree management and protection stuff, £65 per hectare per year. And the permitted area, the minimum area, is 1/10 of a hectare, almost any piece of land. If you look at the specifications include management requirements and then what's called non-productive investment requirements. That is just basically the capital items that are funded. And this is the sort of tick box that an inspection officer would go through. And it includes, if you like, the establishment criteria. So the first one is just at the end of the first year, say the site is inspected, an inspector would check that all capital works are required. That's erecting the tree guards, anchor pegs and stakes by the 1st of June in the first year of the agreement. Then the next one is just complete the claim form. But then the specifications are plant the trees at approximately 5 meter spacing. This is an approximately equivalent to 400 trees per hectare or 80 trees per 0.2 hectares. The key word that we have found in that is the word approximately. This is very liberally interpreted. In other words, if a farmer wishes to establish the wider rows of trees, say 8 meters, and put 3 meters between trees, that is perfectly acceptable within the scheme. The key thing is the 400 trees per hectare is the establishment density. And then there are specifications for planting each tree with a net guard and stake and peg and so on. And then there's a list given for trees to be selected from. I'll just come to that in a minute. Then there are annual management requirements. That was just getting the whole thing established. Then this is what the landowner, the farmer, has to do thereafter is retain and management the area and locate and so on. Successfully establish the trees for the duration of the agreement. That's 5 years, which is the first drawback in it, really. After 5 years, technically, you can just pull the whole lot out and you don't have to pay back your money because that's the end of the agreement. You can either graze or manage the land between the trees. That allows for cropping, any form of agriculture within the trees. And then there's other requirements, so on, keeping field records and stuff like that. The main point is the land is obviously farmland, classified as farmland, and you can basically farm it in whatever system you want. The tree species list, this is not, native trees are not specified in this. When we come to the riparian buffers, they do specify native trees, but Jim Owen and myself will be pleased to see that sycamore is on this list, not without good cause, and Northern Ireland, seeing as I had some input into it. And of course, ash isn't allowed. And fruit trees are allowed, and they should be combined with forestry species. It should be you can allow basically up to 50%, 49% if you like, of fruit trees in the mixture if you want. So that does allow for some quite interesting horticultural combinations of an agroforestry. Then I've just highlighted a few interesting points from the rest of the specification. This is what farmers will get in their agreement. Things like just basic information on plant your trees between October and mid-March, do not plant trees in waterlogged soils, so on, so on. Do not plant sycamore on poorly drained soils. Then about over power lines and cables, just ordinary sensible stuff about planting trees. Then they do recommend prior to planting spot spray patches. In other words, when they say they're insisting, this is in the specification, no one's really going to be around to quite check you do that, but they say spot spray patches 1 meter in diameter with an approved herbicide before planting. And then further down, after planting, keep a 1 meter diameter weed-free zone around each tree. And it says also plant a mixture of species, and we'd strongly recommend that now, given, for example, what's happened to ash and so on. It's wise to use mixture anyway. A bit about pruning. Use wider net guards for tree protection rather than rigid tree shelters. And then, interestingly enough, further down in silvopastoral system, this is in the department's own guidelines. In silvopastoral systems, graze with sheep for the first 7 years at a stocking rate, yet it's only a 5-year scheme. So there must be, hopefully there's some plans to extend at the end of the day, who knows. So that's really our main agroforestry measure. Whenever it was set up, and I think it was 2017, the overall target was 52 hectares of land. That was what was budgeted for in the scheme. They didn't really have great, the department really did not have great faith in how well it would be taken up. Currently, there are 58 applicants across Northern Ireland in agreements totaling 40 hectares of land, which I suppose, it's not a huge amount, but it is 77% uptake of the target, so that's encouraging. All of those who are applicants are farmers, which is encouraging, and we will now sort of work, or the department anyway, I retired since then, we now work with this group of farmers, and because that'll give us a wide diversity of situations and objectives. And the policy leader has said that hopefully we can work with these applicants. Hopefully they'll make it a success and they'll spread the word. That will encourage further uptake in the next few tranches of the scheme. That was after the first 2 tranches. We plotted out there, we're given a plot of the distribution of where the applicants were from. It was encouraging to see, they were from all over Northern Ireland. They weren't just around the Loughgall area or good farming areas, whatever. There was a good spread, and I think that is continued at the end of the day. CAFRE, the College of Agriculture, Food and Enterprise, provides the backup and the support for those people who are in the scheme. Then just a word or two about the other schemes to plant trees. As I said, there's an option to plant riparian buffers at 2 and 10 meters from the stream or water course, planted with native trees. And then there are various specifications for those and what they can do. The 2 payments are given there for 2 meter width, £6.31 per meter in the first year, and then really nothing much after that for years 2 to 5. These are all 5-year schemes, but the development of those from previous schemes like that is that all that land is actually eligible for basic payment as well. Previously, that would have been taken out of your basic payment land once you'd fenced it off from agriculture and planted trees in it. Now it remains eligible, all the land area remains eligible for basic payment and still classed as agriculture. And the list of tree and shrub species for that they're all natives, and there's a broad range there you can pick from. In its guidelines, the department also gives people clear instructions of where the trees should be planted. They plant them in groups along the water course to leave gaps in between. Presumably those are so that animals could access the water if they needed to get in to drink or not. I don't quite see the logic of it anyway, but the trees are planted in 7 or 4 blocks or whatever. And if you look at that was for the 10 meter buffer. For the 2 meter buffer, the same sort of principle, planted in 7 by 2 meter blocks with 3 trees or shrubs in each block and leaving gaps in between, and so on. And there's also additional funding for gates and water piping into those fields. Then if we note about creation of traditional orchards, there the payment for the first year is £3,800 per hectare, and each year thereafter £110 per hectare per year. And the aim of that option is basically to conserve local rare and unusual varieties of fruits. And there's a very specific approved list of varieties, and these are rootstocks. These are particular to Northern Ireland, and it says there at least 3 different varieties of apple trees must be planted. No, no varieties must more than 1.5 plant bare root and approximately 100 trees per hectare. That you're getting that particular payment, and it gives 2 tables, which I'm not putting in just to show it's very much focused on the local interest, heritage apple varieties of Northern Ireland, and then also using particular rootstocks that are recommended for traditional orchards. Now, it's interesting in the specifications for the orchards, it says clearly the understory grassland in the orchard may be mown or grazed. It may be preferable to mow in the first few years. If the trees are adequately protected, in other words, there's no specification whatsoever how you should protect the trees, whereas a very specific specification in the agroforestry measure about how the trees should be protected. But it says new orchards can be grazed from the start, and blah blah, sheep and geese have been the traditional grazers of orchard grass. Planting hedges, as once again, that can be used to border an agroforestry trial, and those are native trees, have to be in those hedgerows, and those are the double row of fencing is funded, and you have to use a mixture of species, and you have to have, I think it's 8 trees in every 100 meters or something like that. Okay, so that's the situation in Northern Ireland, where the agroforestry, my criticisms of it before we move on, and when you're thinking about Eugene's, okay, it's an agriculture measure, that's a good thing. It's an environmental farming scheme, a measure, but it's very, very, I mean, the payment at £1,600 odd per hectare for establishment really is very low. And I think you'll clearly see the difference whenever Eugene talks to us about the situation in the south of Ireland. Okay, Eugene, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Harriet. You probably want to know what my favorite tree is. I'm going to break tradition and not only go for a conifer, but I'm going to go for Scots pine, because it's a wonderfully resilient tree. It's got this all year color. It's got this magnificent red bark, this huge kind of tradition with it. Was nearly disappeared in Ireland, but there's sort of small areas remained, and you still see it appearing in when bogs are sometimes dug through. You get some bog deals. So it's a magnificent tree, magnificent. I love it, and highly recommend it. So, yeah, our just moving on from Jim's presentation, we went up and we saw what he did up in Loughgall, and we figured it could easily work in a forestry context down in the south, in our forestry program. So we set up a plant and a grant and premium category 11, and for the tranche of from 2015 to 2023, and under that we got we had a target of 200 hectares by 2020. Now, as we know, it dragged on, but at the moment we have about 79 applications, which is over 200 hectares, and 50 hectares are planted, and 23 farmers are in receipt of payments, and that's changing almost every week now, because there are more and more of them being planted and coming through. So could I have the next slide, please? So these are some of the examples of what were planted under the old scheme. A lot of them around Cork. May have had something to do with some of the presentations that we had down in West Cork, but there's now ones in Galway. Next slide, please. In Kildare, in Meath, up in Monaghan, and in Cork, again in Rosscarbery. So there was good take up, and we in the Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, we reckoned that this would really be a way of producing quality timber while at the same time giving the farmer landowner huge flexibility in what they do with the land. And it was largely for silvopastoral systems in the last program. But going forward, such is the interest in the south with agroforestry, that the afforestation program, which is a proposed program at the moment, we have it submitted to the EU and we're waiting for approval from them. But there's huge interest. So the silvopastoral system is there, and we're also hoping to introduce silvoarable systems and forest gardening as two pilot projects. And because again, there was an element of interest there. And again, we based our initial scheme on good hard science and work that was done by Jim. So we wanted to make sure that when we put a scheme or anything together, that it would work, that we knew it would work, because we didn't want the scenario where you tried something and say, oh yeah, we tried that and it flopped, but we knew it would work, and it did. So next slide, please. So I'm not going to quiz you on all the figures there, but just to give you an idea of, there's all these forest types now, FTs, and you see at the top there, you've got native wood forest, which is native woodland scheme, and then there's forests for water, which is our forests that are targeted to protecting water. And you can see there's a lot of new variation in a lot of the new proposed planting. So there at FT8 is agroforestry. And if we move on to the next slide, please. Just so that you don't wreck your eyes trying to read those figures, I made them a little bit easier. So the old grant rate was 5,620. So we're really throwing everything in the kitchen sink, everything at it now to try and stimulate interest. The new rate has gone up to 8,555 because the establishment costs just weren't covering. The grants just weren't covering it, so we had to increase it. The old premiums was 645 for 5 years. That is now, the proposed rate is increased to 975 and increased to 10 years. There was a kind of when farmers, landowners went through all the various grant and premium categories, and they saw everything else at 15 years and agroforestry at 5. It was a bit of a turn off for a lot of the farmers, and so there's no cumulative target area this time. So we're just expecting it to contribute to overall figures of planting, because again, this is under the afforestation program. We have the lowest level of forestry in Europe. Northern Ireland is even less. So we're really desperately trying to reverse this trend and get more trees on. And we see agroforestry playing a role. So next row, please. Yeah, thanks. So some of the conditions are a minimum of 400 trees per hectare, as in Jim's trial. We have 1.5 meter shelter with 2 posts. We had one initially, and then we was getting concerned calls from landowners saying that the tube was being squashed. So we introduced a new one, another one. And then we secured it with wire because the sheep we found were eating the plastic ties. We initially went with 90 plus centimeter plants, but we found that actually the smaller plant does better in the tubes. The thinking with the bigger plant was that it would get out of the tube quicker, but in fact, the smaller plant seems to do it. We don't want any spraying. We don't want any fertilizer. We want to encourage multi-species swards instead. This is largely because landowners will also be eligible for organic payments, which is about 170 euros per hectare as well. So to fall in line with their conditions, we want to avoid spraying and fertilizer. I don't think it's a bad thing anyway, at the best of times. Also, when you're planning, if you're going to use rows, and again, we have a maximum width of 10 meters between the rows, and that's largely a silvicultural thing at the moment, because the side competition with the final crop trees is to ensure quality trees. You need a certain amount of side competition. So we've gone for 10 centimeters, and there are options if you want to go beyond 10 meters in other schemes, which I'll touch on. We want to avoid monocultures. We've learned the hard way with ash and Phytophthora riborum, with larch, and of course we've long lost the elms and so on. So we figure we want to diversify in our plantations going ahead. And 15% of a planting can be fruit and nut under the silvopastoral system, because there was a lot of interest from people regarding fruit and nut trees. So we've introduced 15% to the scheme, and you can plant it singly, rows, or in groups, and broadleaves and conifers are considered. And again, it's very flexible compared to conventional forestry. It's extremely flexible compared to others. So the silvo-arable systems, again, this is going to be a pilot project, and it's we're hoping to get 30 hectares per year, and it's as I say, pilot project. And here's Alan Kingston with the demonstration plot in West Cork with the Aronia berries. So we'll be designing and hopefully getting people in with plantations like this. Next slide, please. And then forest gardening is going to be a huge learning cliff for us, because there's again a lot of interest in it, and I know there's a lot of interest in the UK with forest gardens and all over Europe. So we're thinking of putting it in as a pilot measure, and maybe 6 hectares a year and 1 hectare plots. And so we'll learn a lot from several of these projects going forward. That's the plan. Next slide, please. So once the tubes have gone, we want a system there in order to manage the trees after that. Unlike the kind of scheme that they have in the north, the trees down here under the forestation program, because they'll be considered forestry, they're protected under the Forestry Act. So there is a long-term view. And so we assume that they will be there, and still after the premiums are finished. So, and after the tubes have been removed. So we want to ensure that they continue to be protected. So this money will go towards replacing tubes with geotextile mesh, and maybe remove or replace the second post and introduce some formative shaping. Next slide, thank you. Ash dieback, of course, agroforestry is an option for those who are replanting on areas that have died in the ash dieback. Many of them won't be eligible for premiums, but the grants will be there to cover the replanting. Usually the land is good land because it was planted with ash, usually well drained and possibly with no drains involved. So it mightn't be too difficult to put it back into agroforestry, and it's another option. Next slide, please. For those who don't want to go into forestry or have their land classified as forestry, there's the acres scheme, which is replaced the REP scheme, and it has money to create traditional orchards, planting trees in riparian zones, tree belts for ammonia capture. And again, they can be planted singly, in rows, or in groups. The thing is, the density of trees, it's only 300 trees, really. So it's for those people who want wider spacing and not wanting to be under the forestry umbrella. The eco scheme, again, is there as well, and some of the landowners will be eligible for this too, but it's only 3 trees per hectare. But you know, in those trees can be planted anywhere, so you can accumulate the 3 trees per hectare. So you can have them scattered in a particular area where you might want them to provide shelter, and they can be widely spaced and protected with good shelters, so they can provide a kind of a parkland situation going forward. And indeed, even the other designs would be thinned out going forward. So that's something to think about. The densities will change from 400 trees down to 150 anyway. Jim, you might talk about the Irish Agroforestry Forum.
Just to wrap up, really, I mean, following the great work that Eugene has done in the south, and we started to, about 4 or 5 years, we started to get a lot of interest in agroforestry, and you know, we were a few of us who were just actually trying to deal with that, and we realized we needed to actually get a more formal body that could meet that need. So we set up the Irish Agroforestry Forum, paralleling and in cooperation, full cooperation with the Farm Woodland Forum, where we act as a coordinated voice for the agroforestry interest across the island, whole island of Ireland. The aim is to educate, to disseminate the research, to promote agroforestry in farms, advise policy, and train practitioners. And we've been fortunate enough to get funding for a lot of you have contact with Maureen Kilgore, who's our project officer, and she's been helping drive the whole forum forward. We've got to the stage now where this year we've got additional funding to run an international conference in agroforestry this November in West Cork, lovely area, Bantry Bay, lovely in November as well, no tourists and well worth coming. So put the date in your diaries, and we'll circulate everyone that's in the Farm Woodland Forum will get details of this International Agroforestry Forum Conference, which will be very much looking at climate adaptation and mitigation from a farmer's perspective and how agroforestry can meet that. So we look forward to seeing many of you can make it across then as possible. Thank you very much indeed from both of us.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much for that presentation. And I've always wanted to go to Cork, so this sounds perfect. You guys might want to reflect on some of the discussion actually that your presentations has generated in the chat for when we get to the end of our session and have our Q&A. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Geraint, please, if you're ready to go.
Well, Harriet, thank you. Good evening. I'm Geraint Jones. I'm the Farm Woodland Forestry Specialist for Farming Connect here in Wales, covering Wales. I'll share my screen, and while I do that, just talk about my favourite tree, which has to be the oak. It's an all-rounder and fantastic for biodiversity. Produces so many different products, and I like the acorns for the pigs in the autumn. So yeah, has to be my favorite. Just to get on this to, there we are. Okay, is that can everybody see that now?
Yeah, spot on. Yeah.
Okay, so agroforestry funding here in Wales, I've concentrated specifically on the funding side, and it is this week Welsh Farming Week here. A lot of talk about reducing emissions, etc. So very apt that we're talking about this this evening. Just very quickly, initially talk about different planning designs, and there are different templates. There's a whole range of there's no specific rigid plan in place. Suffice to say that the last diagram on the right with individual trees, single or more, as in a parkland landscape, is the only agroforestry category measure that's available for actual funding, but I'll cover the others in the other schemes as well. So all these are common to Wales, many of which are of can be seen on some of our demonstration farms for Farming Connect. So the payment rates at the moment, so we're talking about different categories, woodland creation schemes. We've got native biodiversity, 2 tiers there, 1100 and 1600 trees per hectare. Enhanced mix, 2,500 trees in the native carbon. But the agroforestry is the only agroforestry funding under the category of agroforestry under the woodland creation scheme is at 80 trees per hectare at 12 metre spacings, and that's £1,600 per hectare, which is quite poor, which accounts for the low uptake. However, we are in transition from a single farm payment into a new sustainable farming scheme. And I'll talk about that more in the future. So the P001 agroforestry option covers 80 trees per hectare, individual tree fencing, 3 guards around it. It's not eligible for woodland creation premium payments. Planting, as I said, at 80 trees per hectare, which equates to about £20 per tree. The agroforestry option pays £30 per hectare per annum over a 5-year period for care and maintenance as well, which again is low. But that will undoubtedly change in the new sustainable farming scheme. Grazing level, some of the issues that are linked to it. So grazing level has a minimum stocking level for the area of scattered planting at 0.4 livestock units per hectare at any time between 1st of May and 30th of September. And the tree planted must be a large whip over 1.5 metres in size and a suitable sized tree shelter to protect against mammal damage. So that's the agroforestry grants. There is also probably more suitable, although not identified as agroforestry, when we have a small grants scheme and a small woodland creation scheme. Under the small grant scheme, there are different categories: water, carbon, landscape and pollinators, which covers and accommodates the planting of orchards, hedgerows, etc. as well. But specifically for the woodland creation scheme, you can actually plant for shelterwoods, watercourses, buffer zones, etc. In field corners, small fields, stock shelter, biodiversity, wood fuel. This scheme provides financial support for small areas of tree planting on land between 0.1 hectares and up to 2 hectares. So this is the kind of thing that we'd be looking at. So this is a dairy farm with a matrix of linear hedgerow, mature hedgerows, and small areas planted up in field corners, etc. Those are actually farm tracks for the cows to travel between the paddocks and in and out of the parlour. And that's payment rates available in the small grant scheme woodland planting. You've got different categories there on the left-hand side. The rate for trees per hectare densities are in the middle column, and the payment rates on the right-hand side. So wet woodland and stream side, native biodiversity, wet woodland and stream side, again at the different rates of 1,600 trees per hectare, more native biodiversity at a larger density again, and the wood fuel production at 2,500 trees per hectare. We have shelter woods again, which can be productive at 2,500 trees per hectare, and red squirrel planting for red squirrel habitat at 1,600 and 2,500 trees per hectare, and native shelter woods at 2,500 trees per hectare. And the payment rate linked to that for the infrastructure, fencing, etc. There has recently been a review here with the Welsh Government, and a few weeks ago they raised the fencing rate from £5.56 a metre to £8.32 a metre, although that still isn't quite meeting the double figure figures for actually creating a new fence or establishing a new fence. Deer fencing there is Len 93 per metre, standard gates as you can see, and hardwood gates, etc. Timber bridle gates and posts, and timber kissing gates and posts. Everything that you'd need in to protect the woodland. So, as I said, the woodland creation scheme at the moment will be part of, and is a sort of pilot, I suppose, for the new sustainable farming scheme, which is to commence in 2025, and it replaces the basic payment scheme, the old Gloucester agri-environment scheme, and other rural development measures. As we have left Europe now, it's not European funding anymore. And the new scheme has different tiers, one of which is Farm Connect support. So another element of funding towards planning, design and advice is through Farming Connect. And we can support training from farmer to farmer, knowledge sharing and innovation. New Farming Connect program includes a redesigned advisory service tailored to meet future needs, and New Farming Connect model to ensure farmers can be confident in receiving the advice, guidance and support they need to transition and deliver the actions in the scheme should they choose to apply for it. So in creating new woodlands in the future, these are some examples. Optional actions in the optional tier, farmers will be supported to increase the width of hedgerows on boundaries between farms, for instance, or 3 meters and over, unless separated by woods and roads and walls, etc. And this is a biosecurity measure. So you can increase the width of your existing, if there's hedgerow, or even if obviously if there's just a fence line. It's the first thing I do when I get onto farms. Look at the farm boundary, and there are plenty of opportunities there. We've also got a collaborative action. Another example would be to support projects to manage and create joined up woodland at a scale larger than the individual farm to benefit the farm environment and wider society. So you could be talking, neighbours could be joining up to deliver planting and similar agroforestry planting in neighbouring fields, if that's the case. And I'm really excited to see some more joined up thinking at a scale to be able to apply for that within the collaborative action category. Welsh Government have stated that would any application now will contribute to the SFS universal actions of farmers having a target area of tree cover on their farms. So don't know if you're aware, but there is, we are at the consultation stage at the moment with regards to transition to this new scheme. And there is a target of 10% of the farm having to be woodland cover to be able to access the scheme. And payment rates and models for the scheme are still being developed. There will be no disadvantage to farmers by choosing to create woodland or hedgerows, shelter belts ahead of the new scheme. So farmers can apply as and when the windows for these schemes are open. The next window opens in July, I think, 3rd week of July, for new planting. And they will contribute to the new sustainable farming scheme points in future. So farmers won't lose out. So agroforestry, we can provide advice and through the advisory service for Farming Connect. And again, some of the services we provide mentoring, and it's a total of 15 hours per mentor for a team of mentors who will be able to support and challenge their peers on a wide range of topics, and that includes new planting, agroforestry, woodland management, etc. So it's a really useful service. Somebody who's been there and done it, has the experience, and can go on to farm talk with a farmer and another pair of eyes to walk the farm and help the farmer make decisions. The skills and training, I think, is really important as well. There's a whole tranche of skills training where you can acquire the key skills and competencies you need, meet your personal business and technical objectives. All training is fully funded or subsidised by up to 80% through Farming Connect. So things like planting, new planting, etc. We're also delivering over the next, within this Farming Connect programme, a series of masterclasses specifically for different categories, but specifically for agroforestry, where the first will be basic agroforestry principles, and the second masterclass will be a deeper dive, if you like, into planning and design and the intricacies of making agroforestry fit the farm. And of course, more importantly, I spoke about mentioned reducing emissions earlier on. There's an opportunity to complete a baseline to start your journey through the Farming Connect programme. So it's essential to plan ahead to ensure your business is resilient and fit for purpose and fit for the future. So you can complete plans for business, woodland, carbon and biodiversity, baseline data so you can benchmark against, and Farming Connect provides a package of support tailored to your requirements, which will help you make well-informed decisions. Completing baseline studies will assist us to identify which interventions best suit your business. I think it's a really fantastic opportunity for farmers now, especially with a race to net zero in 2050. So last but not least, the protect and enhance existing resource. I think there are a lot of existing agroforestry models out there naturally occurring in linear hedgerows, in clusters of trees, individual trees, etc. This particular landscape here is used by a farmer in Bala for his ewes and lambs, but cows and calves as well at calving time late in the spring. So it's really important. While we haven't got any woodland management funding available at the moment, it will be available in the new sustainable farming scheme. So looking forward to that coming back on the agenda. So protecting and enhancing existing resource, really important as well. And that's it for me. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much, Geraint. I particularly love that you have funding specifically for woods for red squirrels, and that also you put so much effort into mentoring and training and providing subsidy for that. I think that's really, it seems different from a lot of what we've heard this evening, and yet it's so important when it comes to making people feel confident pursuing agroforestry. Whilst you guys maybe all reflect on what you think of each other's government policies when it comes to supporting agroforestry, we're going to dip out of government support for agroforestry for a moment and hand over to Ilona, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the kind of developing carbon markets, possibly maybe some of the work she's been doing on the agroforestry carbon code, and yeah, take it from there, Ilona. But don't forget to start with your favourite tree.
I will not forget to start with my favourite tree. No, thank you, Harriet. Yes, my favourite tree is, I've probably just stopped sharing now, haven't I? Sorry.
You haven't stopped, but it's not full. It's full now. Yeah.
It is a lime tree because they smell lush at this time of year, and they have a really nice form when they're young, but also they come in all weird and wonderful shapes as well when they mature as well. So probably due to damage, but still they're a really nice tree, and they're flowering at this time of year. So if you're seeing them, give them a good sniff because they're really nice. I'm going to talk about carbon. I'm going to talk about the Woodland Carbon Code. I'm going to touch a bit on the Agroforestry Carbon Code that the Woodland Trust and Soil Association and others have been working on, but because that's kind of in its early stages of development, the Woodland Carbon Code is what we've got now in terms of a funding mechanism for agroforestry, and it's kind of loose in that term. So I'm going to try and show you ways in which you can adapt the Woodland Carbon Code to try and fit lower density planting, but it's not best suited for it, I will admit. So just going to talk a bit about what is carbon offsetting, and Woodland Carbon Code accessing and applying for that, but also densities that could potentially work a bit lower as well. What is a carbon offset? People use the term all the time. We can talk about carbon in terms of our natural environment and quantifying things in carbon, but I think it's best to be explicit when you're talking about carbon offsetting. And the carbon offset is a reduction or removal of carbon dioxide equivalent in order to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. The reason I underlined carbon dioxide equivalent there is just because you'll see it written like that. And essentially what it's taking into account is methane and nitrous dioxide as well. So it's just an easy way of bracketing them all under one umbrella. But essentially those are the core greenhouse gas emissions. And obviously as in a business as usual scenario, as we all know and as we're all living in, we're polluting more than we're either sequestering or reducing. So in order to try and balance that, we obviously want to work towards net zero, and our governments, I know all of the governments have set a target for 2050 across the UK. So trying to balance the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are produced to the amount that we're trying to remove from the atmosphere. And there's two ways of doing that. Step one, which is reducing your activity and what you're doing to the absolute bare minimum. And the second step to that, if you're a business, is to offset your emissions, and if you're a farm business as well. So just to give a bit of background on the Woodland Carbon Code, which is a carbon offsetting standard. The Woodland Carbon Code provides guidance on eligible new woodland creation schemes and how to measure carbon sequestered in trees and in your wood. It's generally focused on above ground biomass. It's managed by Scottish Forestry, but the management is devolved to the different governments in terms of information sharing and grant scheme differentiation and that sort of thing. It doesn't measure the carbon of existing woodland hedgerows or ecosystem services. And the reason I say that is it's that business as usual scenario. So you know, if we're carrying on as normal, we're polluting more than we're sequestering. So essentially what carbon should be funding is projects that are new and that are here to sequester carbon, either a reduction or a removal in carbon from the atmosphere, not our kind of business as usual scenario, which is the kind of the biomass, the tree biomass that we already have in the UK. So eligible projects under the Woodland Carbon Code, the kind of land that you can put as sort of eligible area needs to have not been wooded for quite a long time, actually for 25 years. The definition of woodland cover is more than 20% canopy cover, which seems quite low. So you have to provide that you haven't already got a wooded scenario. So yeah, kind of be careful where you draw your boundaries. But yeah, on average, a woodland in terms of its definition is 20% canopy cover in England, Wales and Scotland, and 25% in Northern Ireland, to appreciate that sort of, yeah, it's a less treed and smaller area. The projects must be additional, which means it has to be new. Woodland creation has to be new, agroforestry, new planting. Can also be natural regen and direct seeding as well. They're both eligible under the Woodland Carbon Code, but it needs to be a new project, not an existing one or something that's been planted in the last few years. And it needs to be permanent as well, and you need to provide evidence of the permanence of sequestration on that land. It can't be reversed once you meet the project duration and length immediately. There's no minimum planting area under the Woodland Carbon Code, but there is a minimum trees per hectare area, which is 400 trees per hectare. And we've talked about that as well in some of the government grants here. And fruit and nut trees are currently not eligible under the Woodland Carbon Code. The reason being is there's not reliable models for how they sequester carbon. It's a real barrier really to agroforestry trees and putting those under the Woodland Carbon Code, even at such low trees per hectare. But yeah, unfortunately, yeah, there's not enough kind of data to back up the kind of average carbon rates across the UK. So I mean, to take from this slide that looks very complicated, if you're going to take one thing, is to register your project with the Woodland Carbon Code before you plant it, before you even, you know, prepare your site. And the reason being is that you're showing that you had the intention to put your project under the Woodland Carbon Code or any carbon standard. You need to show that intention before carrying on with the project. And that just proves that, you know, you're considering carbon right from the outset of your planning. You might have heard of terms validation, verification, and you're seeing them here. Probably important to note that validation and verification require a cost with them. They're around £2,000 to £2,500 pounds to get a third-party audit to do a validation and verification. You do the validation once your site is established, once your site is planted or regenerated, and you repeat the verification process. So that really sets the kind of barrier and the precedent to how large a project you would need to make it viable to cover some of the costs that are involved with putting your project under a carbon scheme. And I'll just touch on the difference here between pending issuance units and woodland carbon units. Pending issuance units are a promise to deliver a woodland carbon unit in the future. And the distinction here is that you can sell pending issuance units up front. Your project obviously is in the very early stages, and your trees have not sequestered carbon yet because they're small whips that you've put in the ground, or agroforestry trees might be a little bit larger. And what that provides is that if you can sell those units up front, you can get money for your project up front if that's needed to finance the maintenance quite early on in the first few years of your project, where it can be high. But equally, you can hold back and wait to sell your woodland carbon units, which is a sequestered ton of carbon. And that is what buyers in particular are looking for in terms of making claims against being carbon neutral or kind of net zero claims that they might want to make as an organisation. So yeah, probably the most interesting slide in this presentation so far is, and I've gone with acres here because I thought that would be a preference to the audience as opposed to hectares, which I am used to working in. But essentially, I'm showing the different densities of trees per acre, how much carbon you can expect, and I've gone with an average £20 price per PIU. I'm basing that on the market average that I'm hearing to date, but also there's the Woodland Carbon Guarantee in England, which reflects market price, and the recent auction I think was £22 per PIU. So I'm not too far off using that as an example. So the lowest density trees you can plant, I mentioned 400 trees per hectare, or it's 162 trees per acre under the Woodland Carbon Code. But obviously you're not even going to recoup putting 1 acre of even 160 trees per acre under the Woodland Carbon Code, because you've got £2,500 validation and verification fees ongoing over the length of your project. So I would say the sort of starting point for a viable project is about 5 hectares, or sort of 12, 13 acres in terms of being able to recoup the cost of third-party audits that you must go through. And this is based off native broadleaf planting over a 100-year project length. So that's quite a commitment in time. Obviously, the shorter the project length, the lower amount of tons of carbon you've got, and therefore the lower amount of income. But you'll kind of see that there's a sort of cut-off, and it's around 1,100 stems per hectare in densities, where basically you get to, in terms of the carbon calculator predicting, or it's 445 trees per acre, where almost you can kind of go more dense than that, and actually doesn't make too much of a difference to the carbon. But obviously introducing thinning would have another impact on your carbon sequestration as well. Just to lastly briefly touch on the Agroforestry Carbon Code that, as I say, the Woodland Trust, Soil Association have led on this project. The Woodland Trust, Finance Earth, Organic Research Centre and Scotland Rural College have been involved as a group to try and look at the viability of developing an agroforestry carbon code. And we've been working with the Woodland Carbon Code on this as well, who have been advisors to that group. We trialled the Agroforestry Carbon Code on 6 pilots in England, tried to get a geographical spread, as you can see, and we've got 2 pilot sites in Scotland as well. We're just at the tail end of the project of the first year, and we're writing our report up now. And what we're tending to find is, obviously, particularly if you're just looking at above ground biomass, the projects don't tend to be viable in terms of tree density and carbon sequestration, unfortunately. But if you stack it with woodland creation, for example, on your farm, and do sort of more denser planting, but also agroforestry as a combination, then that could be a viable outcome. So the final reporting that we will put out on this project will be in October, and that will be made public because it's a kind of publicly funded project. But yes, and then we'll probably let you know next steps from there. But as I say, we're writing up the final reporting at the moment. So yeah, that's everything from me.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Ilona. So we've got about 40 minutes for questions. So while people think about any questions that they might want to ask kind of unmuted, Jim McAdam, do you mind if I pick on you? You have responded to a couple of questions in the chat, and I just wondered if you would do so verbally as well. Just kind of give a summary of what the question is, and then kind of what you're thinking about the answer was. And other people, while this is going on, feel free to think of what your questions are.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think the first, I'll have to look at the chat and see what they were there. But the first one really was about why did they pick the 400 trees per hectare, why we're so based around that. And that was really because at that time, that was the only, and policy people wanted sort of research-based evidence to underpin the policy. And all they had to go on was there were a range of spacings tried at Loughgall, and the 400 per hectare was the best, but that's just one site, one tree species, and that worked. Now, you know, it was probably as good a stab as anything. A 100 was too low, we know that definitely, and once you get above that, then you have more thinning to do. So 400 was probably reasonable, but going ahead, the general principle is we would like to see much more flexibility in the scheme, much more allowing farmers to plant the type of trees they want at the density they want, and to protect them the way we want, because a lot of the agroforestry scheme in the north was lauded as being in Europe as being one of the first completely computer-based scheme. In other words, farmers could apply on computer, and they could do everything with instructions on computer and get their payment on computer. And so on. There was inspections in between. We really need to move away from that and look more at allowing some innovation, and just look at a more results-based scheme where trees are put in farms in different scenarios, not under any specific protection or layout, if you like, and just allow that flexibility in the scheme, such as those of you who have seen Fred Farley's use of electric fencing to protect rows of trees very effectively, and much cheaper than the protection that's in the scheme, probably much happier for the trees in terms of roots development and so on. It's allowing things like that to go ahead, so being less specific. The other, yeah, somebody answered, Mike, I couldn't think at the time why there were these gaps in the specification for the riparian buffers, and it probably is to allow different light regimes, which would allow, because you also have to plant a mixture of shrubs and trees as well, so you're if you like exploiting quite a big column of light, and in three-dimensionally they are exploiting much more homogeneous or much more heterogeneous environment.
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Aronia berries are, they're very valuable. I know that they're very good for you.
Okay, they're one of those. Are they the new superfoods that I've just not heard
Yeah,
of
they're
yet?
really, yes, they're superfood. They're superfood.
Good to know.
Eugene will know if he's still up.
We'll take those early tips. Not seeing any hands up from our audience, so I would be curious to get a sense from the speakers actually, if you're kind of looking across anyone else's presentation and going, oh, that's not a bad idea, I quite fancy nabbing that one and bringing that into our scheme, or if you're all perfectly satisfied with what you've got going on.
Personally, I think Geraint and his measures in Wales, if they could be, I mean, in our agricultural side of the fence over here, that is something that could, I think, in the future, maybe something that some of those measures could be used at because there's lower stocking there. What we have on the forestry scheme, there is, there is the density, the 400 trees per hectare, and I suppose in a way it is a results-based scheme in that you're paid a premium, and if the trees aren't there, they're damaged, your premiums are suspended. So you're encouraged to look after them that way. So what we're hoping is that there'll be a good cover of trees, but there is a strong silvicultural and a strong forester input into the agroforestry measure here in Ireland, and I suppose it is different to most of the countries in Europe, and I suppose even in the UK we're probably the only one where it's been driven by a forestry side of things. but it's there, and again, agriculture can take place, and it'll be thinned out over time, and the densities will be reduced over time. And again, to fell the trees, you'd apply for felling license. So if someone wanted to thin them out and reduce the stocking at some stage, they'd go through the department, and we'd see, just so that they get the best possible advice. But I think there is potential in what Geraint was outlining there in Wales.
Oh,
Yeah, I think.
Oh, sorry, Grant.
Sorry.
I was going to. We have a hand up, which is quite an exciting moment.
Okay.
So perhaps we could go with the hand and then come back to you for your thoughts on the other schemes. Oliver, what's your question?
Sorry to interrupt there. But yeah, I had a question about short rotation coppice. I've actually recently planted up an agroforestry site at our place in Shropshire, and part of it was about an acre of short rotation coppice, which is a mix of willow and poplar. And the reason I planted it was because I really want to have lots of wood chip on the site, which I use for mulching, new trees, and also for the rest of our farm. It's really useful to have loads of wood chip. But I couldn't find any support for planting that sort of thing. So I wondered if anybody knew of, it's very similar to a hedge in a way. It's very dense. You could use other species than willow and poplar if you didn't want just super quick growing biomass, but seems like something that's often overlooked, and I see it as the sort of the carbon engine of my agroforestry plot. This is the place where the most carbon is being drawn down in the smallest area, and it seems like it could be a really important thing to incentivize if done in the right way. So
I think that's a really great question, Oliver. I think this one belongs to Jim O'Neill, because I heard the word Shropshire. But yeah, and if anybody else wants to jump on after Jim for sort of coppice in their respective countries, that'd be great. Jim O'Neill, do you want to kick us off?
Oliver, I noticed Andrew's got his hand up as well. Yeah, it's a difficult one, really. The ELM grants that DEFRA are working on with us, with a number of stakeholders, are, from their perspective, focusing very much on carbon sequestration. And currently, we're trying hard to get things like short rotation coppice included for substitution, feed, those sort of things. They say there is going to be a place within ELM, but it's probably not going to sit within agroforestry. Now, I'm not sure where it might sit. It might sit in the energy side of the spectrum, but we are, to a body on the agroforestry group, we are continuing to try and fight the fight for inclusion. Because what I mentioned before in my sort of preamble, we're looking for a whole spectrum of agroforestry to be represented in ELM. I really don't want to see something with gaps in it. So what we all collectively think on the call tonight of agroforestry, we do want to see that represented within the grant scheme. But currently, we're not gaining any traction, because the big driver for the money being spent on agroforestry is carbon sequestration, and that's how they're sort of justifying it at the moment. So whilst it seems a bit counterintuitive, they're looking for locked up carbon rather than short-term sort of turnaround carbon. But we will keep fighting the fight for you.
That's very much appreciated. As someone that also has a huge enthusiasm for wood chip, for mulching future trees, very much appreciated. Andrew, were you going to chip in on something Oliver said, or do you have a fresh question for us?
No, a fresh question. I was interested in the carbon payments, and just wondering, so obviously fruit and nut trees were mentioned as being outside the scheme, but are there measures being taken to assess the value of them for carbon sequestration, thinking about their dual role, and also about the number of things like cider apple trees that are standing in the ground, now mothballed?
Ilona, do you want to? It seems that one would sit with you first, I guess.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think Forest Research are doing a lot of research into modelling apple and kind of nut trees in particular, and finding out the average sequestration rates. And also we've done that as part of our agroforestry carbon code project. We're building a model through diameter at breast height measurements, but it's going to take a lot of data collection to get to something that's reliable enough to then use within a carbon standard. So I can't promise that it'll come around anytime quickly, but there are multiple different bodies working on building that model. And yeah, I mean, we will continue to do that as well, as long as we get funding to continue the agroforestry carbon code project.
Thank you, Ilona. Unless you've got another question, Andrew, because your hand's still up. But if Geraint, I cut you off earlier. Would you like to sort of share any reflections that you had on the other schemes represented, or respond to Eugene's point as you were about to before I cut you off?
Yeah, thank you. Just very quickly on the carbon question, we've just completed now a biomass project with Forest Research European Innovation Project down in Brecon, on a cluster of farms measuring biomass in hedgerows, including the tree roots, through LiDAR technology. So I'm looking forward to seeing the results on that. Just back to the schemes. I mentioned the actual agroforestry in Wales has been quite low, which accounts for the low uptake. But I am really looking forward to seeing, I know Welsh Government are working hard on developing the new sustainable farming scheme, and really looking forward to seeing an opportunity for farmers to take opportunity. I really like the grant rates I saw in Ireland, quite tempting, but it's you know, with the for farmers to plant trees, I'm advocating that they plant trees because they want to plant trees. So yeah, the incentives have to be right, but we need to get over the importance of education as well with regards to the multifunctional benefits of trees on farms. So you know, that combined with the right incentive, I think it's an ideal opportunity for farms to plant and to reach the target that's been proposed, which is 10% of the farm being woodland cover, and that includes existing woodland as well. So some will be over that already, but I think they've modelled about 8,000 farms here in Wales at the moment, and the average is between 6% and 7% cover at the moment. So there is ample opportunity for them for farmers to have an opportunity in future to take advantage of new schemes and the planting schemes at the moment.
Thank you. Eugene, were you just cheering Geraint on in his point, or did you want to add something to it?
No, I agree completely with Geraint was saying, that about the training and education is hugely important, and we are hoping to have a big push on training the contractors and just educating, you know, people in what agroforestry is. And one of the biggest interesting things about some of the plantations we have is that the landowners are extremely proud of them. They want to show them off. They want to bring people into them. And the difference between a conventional forest and an agroforest is that the farmer has this interaction. He's moving through the trees all the time, and he can see what's happening. In a conventional plantation, they don't have that interaction. They don't see what's happening in there. They usually shut the gate and leave it. But in an agroforestry situation, they're in there. They can see if a tree is not well, and if the tree is not well, they're really worried about it, and they want it fixed, and they want to look after it. And it's a fantastic thing to see, and it's very, very encouraging. And before I stop, aronia berries, they're from Northeast America apparently, and they're high in antioxidants, and you can make really lovely kind of what is it, juice out of it. And I think that's what Alan Kingston does in Cork. So yeah, they're quite valuable actually. So thank you.
Very happy to learn about aronia berries. It's always interested in an interesting tree crop popping up. It's bang on 9 o'clock. So if everybody's happy, we will wrap up now on time. Before we go, just a reminder that we will have 2 more talks in this series, which I'll try and do a better job of promoting in a timely